So we hear today about bearing fruit. The fig tree bearing fruit. But of course, part of this fig tree needing to bear fruit is it needs to be cultivated and fertilized. And it's part of what we're doing in this season of Lent. This is a season where we recommit ourselves to more deeply live in the spiritual life, to more fully bear fruit. So we're intentional about being more fully cultivated and fertilized during this season so we can bear fruit. But part of spiritually bearing fruit is we have to recognize that sometimes we have misconceptions about who God is in the spiritual life. That there's lies that we as human beings, because of our fallen condition, tend to believe about ourselves, about God, about who we are, and about who He is. And there's a whole list of lies that I would love to talk to you about, but we have limited time, so I'll just address one tonight. The one that Jesus addresses in the gospel today. That we have a tendency to believe this lie that if God really loved me or cared about me, He wouldn't let me suffer. That if God really loved and cared about me, He wouldn't let me suffer. And this is one of those things that, while we probably know and understand this on some level intellectually, it's a lot harder for us to believe that God loves me when I suffer deeper down in who we are, in the depths of our heart, in who we are. It's that common question that arises whenever we see evil and suffering in the world. Why is this happening? Why do bad things happen to good people? Or why must I face this struggle? Why am I suffering? Because when we're in the midst of our own suffering, it's really hard to see anything outside of that suffering. So if God really loved me and cared for me, wouldn't He protect me from all this suffering? Wouldn't He keep bad things from happening to me? And if I were to ask Him, wouldn't He bless my life with blessings of goods and comforts? But there's a dirty little secret to the gospel that Jesus also revealed to us. See, the dirty little secret to the gospel, as Jesus says, is you're going to suffer and die. Jesus doesn't talk about if you suffer, this is what you do. He says when you suffer, this is how you are to live. He says there will be suffering. Because Jesus didn't say, come and take up your Snuggie and follow after me. He said, come and take up your cross and follow after me. He said, this is going to be hard. You're going to suffer. But Jesus comes to overturn the mindset that if one is a greater sinner, they're going to suffer worse. We hear in the gospel today. He says, do you think that because these Galileans suffered in this way, they were greater sinners than all other Galileans? Do you think they were more guilty than everyone else? By no means, Jesus says. That He's overturning this very idea. For it's easy for us to fall into this mentality that suffering is the greatest of all evils. And thus, avoidance of suffering is the greatest of goods. So while none of us necessarily like suffering, we're not necessarily supposed to like suffering, that not all suffering is the greatest of evils, but it's included on the path to a greater good. Just like avoiding suffering has the potential to lead us down a path of evil. One simple analogy, of course, is the analogy of working out. When you exercise and work out, there's suffering involved in this process. It's a little bit painful. But the end result is greater good of health. And so the inverse is true. When I'm sitting on my comfy chair, binge watching Netflix and eating 4 pieces of pie, there's not too much suffering involved with that. It's pretty comfortable. But it doesn't lead me to that greater good. Or on a more extreme level, courage and cowardice. That sometimes we do not do something good because of our fear of suffering. Sometimes we avoid the good because it's easier, because we know doing the good will involve more suffering. But we also have to destroy our mentality that just because something is hard or something causes us to suffer, that it's necessarily the worst thing or a bad thing. Because there's many good things in life that cause us suffering. Sometimes our very families can cause us immense suffering. But it's in loving them and suffering with them that is the very thing that sanctifies us, that helps us to grow in love. And I faced this mentality when I was in seminary. There were some days when seminary was just frankly hard, because it's a very, very big commitment. And there's also this sticky little thing that comes with priesthood called celibacy that you have to choose to embrace. And this idea of giving up something as beautiful as a family and marriage, there were some days where it was just hard to wrestle with that idea. And it was hard to push through. And then, of course, my dear sweet mother would sometimes ask me, "Oh, how's seminary going?" And I say, "Well, it's hard." And she'd immediately jump to, because of course she doesn't want to see her poor son suffer, "Well, maybe you're not called to this." I said, "No, Mother, you don't understand. Yeah, it's really hard some days, and it stinks. But this suffering is something, this process that I'm been wrestling through, this is something that's sanctifying me." See, in wrestling through and making this choice of celibacy, even though it was hard at times, I began to see that this was making me holier. That it was forcing me to really face deep down my deep desires of my heart and the deep things of my heart, of what's really going on here. I'm beginning to ask the question, do I really trust God? Do I really believe that God is everything that He says He is? Do I really believe that God is the fulfillment of the deepest desires of my heart, as He claims? Do I really believe that He can fulfill my heart? Do I really trust Him enough to give up this thing, to step out into the waters out of the boat and follow Him? Am I really just being selfish? And it was in wrestling through that, suffering through that, struggling through that I began to realize some of the level of selfishness that I had, and lack of trust in God that I had, and lack of faith that I had. But I never would have come to that had I not allowed or entered into the suffering. That if I had simply followed the easier and more comfortable path for me, I probably would not have had to face those questions, and my faith wouldn't have deepened those roots. So Jesus didn't come to take away suffering, but to transform suffering. Sometimes I think we twist God or Jesus into the great Tylenol pill, and we think He should be the thing that numbs us to our suffering. But that's not it at all. Because through His suffering, Jesus Christ brought redemption to the world. And as St. Paul says, he has this odd verse in Colossians 1:24. "Now I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake, and in my flesh I'm filling up what is lacking in the afflictions of Christ." There's a couple odd things in there. First of all, rejoicing in sufferings. And secondly, what does he mean about making up what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ? What is lacking in the sufferings of Christ? Well, nothing except my participation in His cross, in His sufferings. You see, because with our sufferings, we can either suffer with Christ and offer our sufferings for the sake of the redemption of the world, offer our sufferings as prayer for others, offering them up on the cross with Jesus Christ, which is what we're invited to do every time we come to Mass. When we celebrate this Eucharist, we're mystically drawn to that one eternal offering of Christ offering himself to God the Father. We're mystically drawn to that moment of Jesus' suffering on the cross. And we're invited to take all our sufferings and offer it up there with Christ, to put it on the cross with Christ, so that he can take and redeem it and transform it into something that can transform the world. And that we can offer our sufferings out of love for others, out of prayer for others. That's why in the season of Lent we also take on voluntary things of self-denial, of voluntary sufferings, that we can offer those as prayers as well with Christ on the cross. That we can either suffer with Christ or without Christ. And to suffer without Christ is hell, and to suffer with Christ is salvation. Or, more simply put, I can either become better or I can become bitter. We can either allow our sufferings to make us better or to make us bitter. And that doesn't mean it'll hurt less, but it'll give it meaning and strength. Because when our suffering is offered out of love, it becomes something new entirely. So to tie this all together, I want to end with this. I know I've already talked about her a few months ago, but Chiara Luce Badano. I know I've talked about her, but it's worth talking about again, as this topic is worth addressing again. But there was a young Italian girl, Chiara Luce Badano, who at age 15 was diagnosed with a very painful form of bone cancer. And while it seemed terrible and tragic, and easy for us to say, why would God do such a thing to such a beautiful young woman who has her whole life ahead of her? That's not how Chiara saw it. Chiara saw it as an opportunity to surrender everything in her life over to Christ. Even her illness, asking Jesus Christ to use even her illness to shine his love into the world. And that when people would go and visit her, they would say that even during her sickness, she just radiated this joy, this light, this life. And people would go to encourage her, and instead they would realize she was the one encouraging them. As Chiara writes in her journal, here everybody is asking for a miracle, for my healing, but I cannot bring myself to ask for it. Maybe this difficulty that I have in asking for it is because I feel that it is not his will. I offer everything, my failures, my pains, and my joys to him, starting again every time the cross makes me feel all its weight. But the important thing is to do God's will. I might have had plans about myself, but God came up with this. This sickness came to me at the right time. You can't even imagine what my relationship with Jesus Christ is like now. I feel Jesus is asking me for something more, something bigger. I might be on this bed for years, I don't know. But I'm only interested in doing God's will and doing that well in the present moment. Before I had this sickness, I still didn't understand. I was too much absorbed in insignificant things, frivolous and transient things, only to discover in the sickness that another world was waiting for me. And all I had to do was surrender myself to it. But now I feel like, as I surrender all this to Jesus, that I am wrapped into a wonderful design, that it's slowly unfolding itself to me. And as one of the doctors wrote about Chiara, through her smile and through her eyes full of light, she showed us that death doesn't exist. Only life exists. So what do we do with our suffering? Because when we surrender it to Christ, he can use it for something more, to shine life in the midst of death and light in the midst of darkness.